You have no idea who you just chose to stop." The words were spoken quietly, almost lost beneath the noise of a crowded city street, but the officer standing across from her would remember them for the rest of his life. It was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon in Washington, D.C., a day filled with passing cars, hurried footsteps, and people moving from one appointment to the next. No one expected that a single encounter on a public sidewalk would expose the difference between wearing authority and truly understanding justice. Dr. Victoria Reynolds stood near the steps of a government building, holding a leather folder close to her side. She was dressed simply in a navy blazer, a white blouse, and polished shoes. There was nothing about her appearance that demanded attention, yet there was something about her presence that made people look twice. She carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime fighting battles without needing applause. She was not there to make a statement. She was there to prepare for one of the most important moments of her career. Across the street, Officer Daniel Whitmore watched the crowd with a familiar sense of certainty. After years wearing the uniform, he had become comfortable making quick assumptions. He believed he could read a situation within seconds. He believed his badge gave him the final word. And on that afternoon, he looked at Victoria and saw only what he expected to see, not the person standing in front of him. He approached with a firm voice and asked questions that carried more suspicion than curiosity. Victoria answered calmly. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She simply asked for understanding. But Daniel had already made his decision. To the people nearby, it was uncomfortable to watch. Some slowed their steps. Some lifted their phones. Others looked away, unsure whether they should speak up. Victoria felt the weight of every silent stare, yet she remained composed. She had spent years learning that dignity was not something another person could take away. The officer believed he was controlling the moment. He believed this was another routine encounter that would disappear by the end of the day. What he did not know was that the woman standing in front of him was not someone without a voice. She was Dr. Victoria Reynolds, a respected legal scholar, a champion for civil rights, and a nominee being considered for one of the highest judicial positions in the United States. But her title was not revealed. Not yet, because sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one who does not need to announce their importance. As the crowd watched and the city continued moving around them, Victoria remained silent, observing every detail, every word, and every choice being made. She understood something Daniel had forgotten: moments of injustice do not disappear. They leave records, they leave witnesses, and sometimes they reveal the truth about the very people who believe they are untouchable. The street had moved on, but the moment had not. For most people walking through downtown Washington, District of Columbia that afternoon, it was only another uncomfortable scene they would mention briefly and forget. But for Victoria Reynolds, every second mattered. She stood beneath the pale afternoon light, listening carefully as Officer Daniel Whitmore continued speaking with the confidence of someone who believed the situation was already decided. His tone carried the certainty of a person who had rarely been questioned. Around them, the city continued its rhythm. Buses passed along the avenue. Office workers hurried toward their next meetings. The sound of footsteps echoed against the concrete sidewalks. Yet within that small space between Victoria and the officer, time seemed to slow. Victoria had learned long ago that moments like this revealed more than words ever could. They revealed patience. They revealed character. They revealed what people did when they believed no one important was watching. Daniel looked at her silence as weakness. He misunderstood her calm as uncertainty. He did not understand that Victoria had spent decades sitting across from powerful people, listening while others underestimated her, and waiting for the right moment to let the truth speak. She had built her career by studying facts, protecting fairness, and believing that every person deserved to be heard before judgment was made. She remembered being a young law student walking into rooms where people questioned whether she belonged. She remembered the quiet doubts, the lowered expectations, and the assumptions she had to overcome before anyone recognized her ability. But those experiences did not make her bitter. They made her determined. To Victoria, respect was not something earned through a title or a position. It was something every person deserved from the beginning. A few feet away, several bystanders watched the exchange unfold. An older man holding a coffee cup looked from Victoria to the officer, sensing that there was more to the story than what appeared on the surface. A young woman standing near the corner whispered that something felt wrong, not because of what was happening alone, but because of how quickly one person had been judged. Victoria noticed those reactions, but she remained focused. She knew emotions could rise quickly in moments of conflict. She knew anger could make people forget their purpose. So she chose something more powerful than anger. She chose control. Daniel continued believing that his authority was the most important thing in that moment. He saw a situation that needed his command. Victoria saw a moment that required accountability. The difference between them was simple but enormous. One believed power came from being obeyed. The other knew power came from serving the truth. And as the afternoon sun moved lower across the buildings of the capital city, neither of them realized that the encounter was becoming something much larger than a single misunderstanding. It was becoming a story that would soon reach a courtroom, a story where every decision, every word, and every assumption would finally be examined. Because the quiet woman standing there was not waiting to escape the moment. She was waiting for the moment to reveal what it truly meant. Long before she stood on that sidewalk in Washington, District of Columbia, Dr. Victoria Reynolds had learned that the hardest battles were often the ones people never saw. They were not fought in crowded rooms or beneath bright cameras. They were fought quietly, in classrooms where expectations were lowered, in offices where her ideas were overlooked, and in moments when she had to prove that her presence belonged. Victoria was born in Atlanta, Georgia, into a family that believed education was a foundation, not a privilege. Her mother was a public school teacher who always reminded her that knowledge could open doors that others tried to close. Her father was a community leader who taught her a lesson she carried throughout her life. Respect should never depend on someone else recognizing your worth. From a young age, Victoria understood that fairness was not something people simply talked about. It was something people had to protect. She studied late nights at the kitchen table, surrounded by books and handwritten notes, determined to build a future where her voice could make a difference. When she entered law school, she quickly discovered that intelligence alone was not always enough to overcome assumptions. There were moments when people questioned whether she belonged in certain rooms. There were moments when they focused more on her appearance than her accomplishments. But Victoria never allowed those moments to define her. She focused on the work. She focused on the people who needed someone willing to stand beside them. Over the years, she became known as a thoughtful legal scholar and a powerful advocate for equal treatment under the law. She worked on cases involving civil rights, government accountability, and the protection of individual freedoms. She did not chase attention. She chased solutions. Her reputation grew because she listened before she spoke and researched before she acted. Colleagues often described her as someone who could enter a tense room and bring a sense of calm without saying much at all. That same calmness was what Officer Daniel Whitmore misunderstood on the street. He saw a quiet woman and assumed she lacked power. He saw patience and mistook it for surrender. But Victoria knew something he did not. True confidence does not need to announce itself. It does not need to prove its importance every second. It simply stands firm. As the investigation into the street encounter slowly began to unfold, the people closest to Victoria started asking the same question. Why had she not revealed who she was? Why had she allowed the situation to continue without using her position to stop it? The answer was simple. Victoria was not interested in special treatment. She wanted the truth to be visible without the protection of her title. She wanted people to understand what happened when an ordinary person, without influence or recognition, faced the same situation. Because for Victoria Reynolds, justice was never supposed to depend on a name, a position, or a powerful introduction. Justice was supposed to belong to everyone. And soon, the world would discover that the woman Officer Whitmore underestimated had spent her entire life preparing for moments exactly like this. The moment the video from the street encounter began spreading through Washington, District of Columbia, people saw only a few minutes of what happened. They saw a respected woman being questioned in public. They saw an officer confident in his actions. They saw a crowd watching in silence. But what they did not see was the history behind the badge. Officer Daniel Whitmore had spent years building a reputation inside the department. To some of his colleagues, he was described as dependable and decisive. He was the kind of officer who believed quick decisions showed strength. But behind that image were questions that had quietly followed him for years. Complaints had been filed. Concerns had been raised. Yet each time, the situation seemed to disappear before it reached a serious review. Daniel had learned a dangerous lesson. If enough people looked away, uncomfortable truths could remain hidden. He became more confident with every year that passed, believing that his uniform gave him protection from consequences. He believed authority was something people were supposed to accept without question. And that belief shaped the way he approached Victoria Reynolds that afternoon. What Daniel did not understand was that the encounter was not just about one conversation on one street. It was about a pattern of choices. It was about what happens when someone stops seeing a person and starts seeing only an assumption. As news of the incident reached officials, attention quickly turned toward the details. Witnesses described Victoria as calm throughout the entire exchange. They remembered how she answered questions respectfully. They remembered how she never tried to use her influence to demand special treatment. That detail stood out. Many people expected someone with her background to immediately reveal her identity and end the situation. But Victoria chose another path. She allowed the process to continue because she believed accountability should not depend on who someone was. It should depend on what happened. Meanwhile, Daniel remained convinced that he had handled everything correctly. He spoke with confidence when asked about the encounter. He believed the attention would eventually fade, just like other difficult moments in his career. But this time was different. This time there were witnesses who refused to ignore what they had seen. This time there were records that could not simply disappear. And this time, the person he underestimated understood the system better than anyone expected. Behind closed doors, legal experts began reviewing the details. Officials started asking questions that had been avoided for too long. How many times had assumptions replaced facts? How many people had been judged before being heard? How many complaints had been dismissed because the person raising concerns did not have enough influence? The answers would soon become impossible to ignore. For Daniel Whitmore, the afternoon had started like any other day in uniform. But for Victoria Reynolds, it became a moment that revealed something much bigger than a single encounter. It revealed the difference between power used to control people and power used to protect them. And as the truth began moving from the sidewalk into the halls of justice, the man who thought the situation was finished was about to discover that some moments do not disappear. Some moments become evidence. The days following the encounter brought a strange silence before the storm. From the outside, it appeared that life in Washington, District of Columbia, had returned to normal. People went back to work. Traffic moved through the busy streets. Government buildings continued their daily routines. But behind the scenes, the questions surrounding what happened on that sidewalk continued to grow. Victoria Reynolds did not rush to make public statements. She did not call a press conference or demand attention. Instead, she returned to the work that had defined her entire career. She reviewed documents, spoke with legal advisors, and listened carefully to the people who had witnessed the event. To Victoria, the most important part was not proving who she was. The most important part was understanding what had happened and why it happened. She knew that a person without her background might not have had the same opportunities to be heard. That thought stayed with her. Meanwhile, Officer Daniel Whitmore continued moving through his days believing the situation would eventually disappear. He spoke with confidence to those around him. He described the encounter as a simple misunderstanding and believed his explanation would be enough. For years, Daniel had relied on the same pattern. Difficult moments would arrive, conversations would happen behind closed doors, and eventually people would move on. But this time, something had changed. The details were no longer hidden. The witnesses were no longer silent. The records were being examined by people who were willing to ask difficult questions. A small legal team assisting Victoria began looking deeper into Daniel's history within the department. They did not search for revenge. They searched for facts. They reviewed past reports, official documents, and patterns that had previously received little attention. What they found was not just one questionable decision. It was a series of moments where judgment appeared to come before understanding. Each document added another piece to a larger picture. Each witness statement showed how important accountability truly was. The story was becoming less about one officer and one woman. It was becoming about the responsibility that comes with authority. As the information reached more officials, one name began appearing. Repeatedly in conversations about the next steps. Judge Michael Harrison. Known for his careful approach and commitment to fairness, Judge Harrison had spent decades inside the legal system. He had seen people with influence attempt to avoid consequences, and he had seen ordinary citizens struggle to make their voices heard. He understood that justice depended on one simple principle. The same standards must apply to everyone. When he received the initial reports regarding Victoria's encounter, he did not focus on her title or future position. He focused on the facts. That was exactly what Victoria wanted. She did not want special treatment because of her achievements. She wanted the truth to stand on its own. As preparations began for a formal review, Daniel Whitmore still believed he was protected by his position. He believed the badge would speak louder than the evidence. He did not realize that the very system he trusted would soon ask him the question he had avoided for years. What happens when the person you underestimated becomes the person everyone is listening to? The morning of the formal review arrived with a quiet tension that seemed to fill every corner of the courthouse in Washington, District of Columbia. Outside the building, people walked past the tall stone entrance without knowing that inside, a decision was being prepared that would reach far beyond one officer and one encounter. The courtroom carried its familiar atmosphere of seriousness. Lawyers arranged their documents. Officials reviewed notes. The sound of footsteps echoed across the polished floors as everyone waited for the proceedings to begin. Victoria Reynolds entered the courtroom without any dramatic announcement. She carried the same calm expression she had shown on the street days earlier. To anyone unfamiliar with her story, she looked like another person seeking answers. But those who knew her understood that she had spent her entire career preparing for moments when fairness had to be defended. Judge Michael Harrison sat at the bench, carefully reviewing the information in front of him. He was known for being patient, thoughtful, and unwilling to make decisions based on assumptions. Throughout his career, he had witnessed many cases where people with authority believed their position protected them from consequences. He understood that a uniform, a title, or a reputation could never replace accountability. Officer Daniel Whitmore arrived with confidence. He looked around the courtroom as if he expected the same outcome he had experienced many times before. He believed this was simply another review that would pass. He believed his explanation would settle everything. What he did not understand was that the room was different this time. The people listening were not ignoring the details. The evidence had been organized. The witnesses had been heard. The questions that had been avoided were finally being asked. When the proceedings began, Judge Harrison focused on the timeline of events. He examined the decisions made that afternoon and the reasoning behind them. Each detail mattered. Each choice revealed something about judgment, responsibility, and the use of authority. Victoria remained quiet as the information was presented. She did not interrupt. She did not seek sympathy. She simply listened because she knew the truth did not need to be forced. It only needed the opportunity to be seen. Daniel listened as well, but his confidence began to change. For the first time, he realized this was not about a misunderstanding that could be explained away. It was about the impact of decisions made when someone believed they would never be questioned. Judge Harrison looked carefully through the documents before him. He paused, allowing the silence of the courtroom to speak. Then he asked a simple question that changed the entire atmosphere. Officer Whitmore, when you made your decision that day, did you ever consider that you might not know the full story? The question remained in the air. Daniel had answered many questions during his career, but this one was different. It was not asking about procedure. It was asking about judgment. It was asking about humanity. And in that moment, The courtroom began to understand that this was no longer just a review of an encounter on a city street. It was a moment where power, responsibility, and truth were finally meeting face to face. The courtroom remained silent after Judge Michael Harrison's question. It was not the kind of silence created by confusion. It was the kind of silence created when everyone understood that the conversation had moved beyond simple explanations. Officer Daniel Whitmore looked down at the documents in front of him, then back toward the judge. For the first time since the encounter on the street, the confidence he carried so easily began to fade. He had prepared answers about procedures. He had prepared explanations about decisions. But he had not prepared for a question about perspective. The review continued with careful attention to every detail. The courtroom listened as witnesses described what they saw that afternoon. They spoke about Victoria Reynolds's calm behavior, her respectful words, and the way she handled the situation without creating conflict. Their statements painted a clear picture of someone who understood the importance of patience, even when facing a difficult moment. Then the focus shifted to the records connected to Officer Whitmore's career. One document after another revealed a pattern of concerns that had been quietly recorded over the years. Some issues involved questionable judgment. Others involved complaints that had never received meaningful attention. None of those individual moments had changed anything before. But together, they created a story that could no longer be ignored. Daniel listened as the information was presented. He looked around the courtroom and saw something he had not expected. The people around him were not treating the situation like another routine matter. They were looking at the facts. They were considering the responsibility that came with wearing a badge. Judge Harrison carefully reviewed each piece of information before speaking. He reminded everyone in the room that authority was not given to create fear or distance between public servants and the people they served. Authority existed because communities trusted those who carried it. Victoria sat quietly as the discussion continued. She remembered every moment from that afternoon, but she also remembered every person who had been in similar situations without having a legal background, a respected career, or people willing to listen. That was why she had chosen not to end the encounter immediately by revealing her identity. She wanted the process to show something important. Justice should not depend on who someone is. It should depend on what is right. As the hearing moved forward, Judge Harrison asked Victoria to speak. The room became still. Everyone expected anger. They expected frustration. Instead, Victoria took a moment before answering. Her voice was calm and steady. She spoke about responsibility, fairness, and the importance of remembering that every person behind a situation had a story. She did not speak to destroy someone. She spoke to make sure the lesson was not lost. Daniel watched her carefully. The woman he had underestimated was now standing before the court with no need to prove her importance. Her character had already done that. And as the hearing reached its most important moment, everyone in the room began to understand the same truth. The greatest power was not found in a uniform, a title, or a position. The greatest power was found in the courage to stand for what was right when the world was watching. The final moments of the hearing carried a weight that everyone inside the courtroom could feel. The room that had once been filled with uncertainty was now filled with understanding. Every document, every witness statement, and every decision made on that afternoon had been carefully examined. The truth was no longer hidden behind assumptions or protected by silence. Judge Michael Harrison looked across the courtroom, knowing that the decision ahead was not only about one officer. It was about the responsibility that came with public trust. Officer Daniel Whitmore sat quietly, no longer carrying the same confidence he had when he first entered the room. The certainty that once followed him everywhere had been replaced by reflection. For years, he believed authority meant having the final word. But now he was facing a different kind of lesson. He was learning that authority without accountability could lose its meaning. Judge Harrison reviewed the findings one final time. His voice remained calm as he explained that the issue was not a single mistake. Everyone could make a mistake. The issue was what happened when someone refused to recognize the impact of their choices. The court found that Daniel's actions showed a serious failure to uphold the standards expected from someone in his position. The consequences would follow through the proper legal and professional channels. There would be investigations. There would be reviews. There would be decisions made according to the rules he was supposed to protect. Victoria listened carefully as the judge spoke. She understood that this moment could easily become about personal victory, but she did not see it that way. She saw it as a reminder that justice was not about humiliating someone who had made a wrong choice. Justice was about making sure the same mistake would not continue harming others. When she was given another opportunity to speak, Victoria looked toward Daniel. The courtroom became completely still. She could have used that moment to express anger. She could have reminded everyone of her achievements, her education, or the position she was being considered for. Instead, she chose something different. A person's worth should never be decided by an assumption, she said, and authority should never be measured by how much power someone can use, but by how much responsibility they are willing to carry. Those words stayed in the room long after she finished speaking. Daniel lowered his eyes, understanding that the woman he had underestimated had never needed to prove who she was. Her actions had already revealed everything. Outside the courthouse, the story continued to spread. People discussed the importance of accountability and the responsibility of those who represent the law. But for Victoria, the most important message was much simpler. She hoped that one day, nobody would need a title, a position, or a public reputation to receive basic respect. As the courtroom emptied, Judge Harrison remained seated for a moment, looking over the files that had brought everyone there. He knew this case would be remembered, not because one person lost a position, but because it showed something far more important. A badge can represent authority. A title can represent achievement, but only integrity can represent justice. And on that day, the truth had spoken louder than any title ever could. Weeks passed after the courtroom decision, but the impact of that day continued to reach far beyond the walls of the courthouse in Washington, District of Columbia. The story of Victoria Reynolds and the choices made during that afternoon became a reminder that justice was not only about what happened in a courtroom. It was about what society chose to learn from those moments. People across the country discussed the importance of accountability, fairness, and the responsibility carried by those who serve the public. For many, the most powerful part of the story was not the decision itself. It was the way Victoria handled every moment before, during, and after the truth was revealed. She had every opportunity to use her position to end the situation immediately. She could have introduced herself and watched everything change within seconds. But she chose patience because she believed a deeper lesson needed to be seen. She wanted people to understand that respect should not arrive only when someone discovers a person's importance. Respect should exist before the discovery. That belief had guided her entire life. As Victoria continued her journey toward the highest levels of the legal profession, she carried the memory of that day with her, not as a symbol of anger, but as a reminder of why fairness mattered. She continued speaking with students, legal professionals, and community groups about the importance of empathy and responsibility. She often explained that laws were not just words written on paper. They represented promises between people and the institutions meant to serve them. Meanwhile, Daniel Whitmore faced the consequences of the review process. His career changed, and the reputation he had built around confidence and authority was replaced by the reality of accountability. The lesson was not that one person had fallen. The lesson was that no position should place someone above the standards expected from them. Judge Michael Harrison reflected on the case long after the hearing ended. He knew that many cases came and went through the justice system, but some carried a message that reached beyond the people directly involved. This was one of those cases. It reminded everyone that justice required more than rules. It required honesty, humility, and the courage to examine uncomfortable truths. Victoria never considered herself a symbol. She considered herself someone who had a responsibility to stand where others might not be heard. Her strength did not come from a future title or a respected career. It came from the values she had carried since childhood. As the city lights of Washington continued shining over the streets where the story began, one truth remained clear. The person who appeared powerless was never powerless at all. She had simply chosen not to reveal her strength until the moment required it. And the officer who believed a badge gave him control discovered a lesson that would follow him forever. Authority can demand attention. A title can command respect. But in the end, truth has the final voice. He thought he was protecting the law. But that day, he learned the law was never about a person wearing a badge. It was about the people who deserved justice.